Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. In this week's episode, I'm going to be discussing what is going on with the International Criminal Court and why the US hates it so much. And if you're tuning in for the first time, my name is Nick Ford and I make videos about politics and what is going on in the world. So if those kind of topics are interesting to you, make sure you subscribe. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter. The links will be down below. You may have missed it, but earlier this year, the International Criminal Court, also known as the ICC, made a pretty big move. They announced that they would be investigating war crimes committed by the US for the first time ever. And the US was not happy about it.
I received word this morning that the ICC Appeals Chamber authorized an investigation into the activities of the Taliban and US and Afghan personnel there. This is a truly breathtaking action by an unaccountable political institution masquerading as a legal body. We will take all necessary measures to protect our citizens from this renegade, unlawful so-called court.
The court announced that they would be investigating war crimes committed in Afghanistan in the early 2000s by pretty much all the warring factions there. That includes the Taliban, the Afghan forces, the CIA, and the US military. And what has got the US government sweating is that the chief prosecutor in the case, veto, says that they have enough evidence to prove that the US committed war crimes there. Since the announcement, US President Donald Trump has done almost everything in his power to block the investigation.
On Thursday, the Trump administration authorized economic sanctions and travel restrictions against ICC officials directly involved in efforts to investigate American citizens or its allies.
Not only has he said the US will not assist in any way, but he's actually placed sanctions and asset freezes on the actual staff of the ICC, and then placed travel restrictions on the family members of those staff. So that means the US is actually attacking the family of anyone that works for the ICC. And sanctions like this are usually only meant for the worst human rights abusers, but never ordinary citizens. Like, that is an absolutely insane overreaction. But the response from the rest of the US political class has been pretty quiet, to say the least, despite the fact that they love attacking Trump for almost anything. So why not this? So I decided to look into this a little further, and I found some pretty crazy stuff out about the US and their relationship to the court. And it all led back to the same conclusion. The US hates the ICC.
We will not cooperate with the ICC. We will provide no assistance to the ICC, and we certainly will not join the ICC. We will let the ICC die on its own. After all, for all intents and purposes, the ICC is already dead to us.
As far as America is concerned, the ICC has no jurisdiction, no legitimacy, and no authority.
So first, a bit of context. The ICC was created when the Rome Statute passed in a conference in Rome in 1998, with the overwhelming support from a majority of the countries in the world. Out of the 162 states that voted, 120 voted in favour, and just 7 voted against, with the rest abstaining. And the US was one of those 7 negative votes. Today, 120 countries are members of the International Criminal Court. But although Bill Clinton signed the Rome Statute back in the year 2000, he never sent it to the US Senate to be ratified, which meant the US never became a member of the court.
Well, the International Criminal Court is troubling to the United States. It's troubling to the administration, obviously troubling to the United States Senate as well. President Clinton signed this treaty, but when he signed it, he said it should not be submitted to the Senate, and therefore never has been, and I don't intend to submit it either.
But still, why this hate towards the court, and why the overreaction from Donald Trump? Well, I found that answer when I stumbled upon this report from 1998. It's a transcript of the reaction from the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations to the creation of the court. And it all outlines a pretty common theme, that the US was only opposed to the court because they were not immune to it. And this immunity theme comes up a lot, so just remember that. These senators in the most important Senate committee in the US all feared the ICC because they knew it was going to be an independent legal body that the US wouldn't have any control over, and that they might actually have to face the consequences for their war crimes. That might sound like a massive exaggeration on my part, but Senator Jesse Helms pretty much admits it all himself. He actually says that he fears the US would be prosecuted for their crime of aggression for any military action that they take without the permission of the UN Security Council. So let me break this down a little bit further. International law states that unless a country is defending itself from an immediate threat, it can't attack or invade another country until they get the backing from the UN Security Council. And the US almost never does this, so they're in violation of international law every time. And Senator Jesse Helms actually admits this, In his next paragraph, he goes on to talk about the US invasion of Panama, the US invasion of Grenada, and the US bombing of Tripoli, and then says, in none of those cases did the United States seek permission from the United Nations, which is an obvious violation of international law. And then he adds, so long as there is breath in me, the United States will never, and I repeat never, never allow its national security decisions to be judged by any international criminal court. So what Jesse Helms is literally saying is that he fears the US will no longer be able to break international law and not be prosecuted for it. It couldn't be any more straightforward than that. But I think the best quote comes from Senator Rod Grams when he says, at present, international law regarding peace and security is largely whatever the Security Council says that it is. With the creation of the International Criminal Court, that will no longer be the case. And if you change the word Security Council and put in United States, you can see what Grams actually means, and that is why the US hates the ICC. Because of the way the UN works, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council get to pretty much dictate international law, and the US is one of those 5 members. But the ICC isn't beholden to the Security Council, so the US has no control over it. Senator Rod Grams fears, like the rest of the US senators, that A, the US will no longer be able to dictate international law, and B, the US will no longer be able to decide who breaks it. And that's a huge problem for the US because they break it so often.
Well, one important action that the United States could take is to live up to its own laws. Of course, it would be nice if it lived up to international law, but maybe that's too much to ask. But live up to its own laws.
If the ICC was controlled by the Security Council, it would never be able to investigate any war crimes committed by the 5 permanent members because they all have veto power, and they'd be able to veto their own war crimes prosecution. So, for example, if US war crimes ever came up for a vote in the Council, the US could simply veto and the vote would be over. And that system would give the US complete and permanent immunity. However, with the ICC independent of the Security Council, the US nor the other permanent members can protect themselves. And Senator Rod Grams literally states these concerns himself when he says, it turns the functioning of the Security Council on its head, and I think that sets a very bad precedent. The Security Council must act affirmatively to stop a prosecutor from taking up a case. This means that the US loses its veto. He then actually goes on to say the court is undermining the ability of the US to use military action, and then actually cites past US war crimes as examples. He's basically saying that the ICC is extremely dangerous to the US because it's an independent legal body that might actually put a stop to US imperialism and for once force the United States to abide by international law. And Senator Grams isn't beating around the bush either. He makes his opposition to the court as clear as day by ending on this line. I hope that now the administration will actively oppose this court to make sure it shares the same fate as the League of Nations and collapses without US support, for this court truly, I believe, is the monster, and it is the monster that we need to slay. It couldn't be any more blatant. And if you want any more proof, the US Ambassador for War Crimes Issues, yes, weird title I know, David Schiffer, actually said that during the negotiations, he tried extremely hard to push for amendments that would have stripped the court of its independence and forced it to answer to the Security Council, which would have granted the US with immunity. However, his proposals were rejected. And this isn't some fringe Senate group. The US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations is extremely influential. And at the time, its members included current presidential nominee Joe Biden, who applauded Ambassador Schiffer's work and said that he reached the right conclusion. And this Senate hearing isn't the end of it, because the way the US acted after the court came into existence in 2002 is even worse. In 2002, George W. Bush tried to force the UN Security Council to pass a resolution which would have imposed Ambassador Schiffer's earlier amendments, stripping the ICC of its independence and forcing it to answer to the Security Council, which would have granted the US with immunity. But none of the other members wanted to do this, so how did the US react? They threatened to veto every UN peacekeeping mission that came up for a vote in the UN Security Council. Human Rights Watch, Richard Decker, called it a new low for the US in its efforts to undermine the court. The Council finally budged when the US actually vetoed a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia. The Council granted the US with immunity for just 12 months to be renewed every 12 months. However, this was far and away from the permanent immunity that Bush had been fighting for. So what did they do next? The US Senate in 2002 passed the American Service Members Protection Act, that has now been dubbed the Hague Invasion Act. It actually authorizes the use of military force against the Netherlands, their NATO ally, because that is where the ICC headquarters are located.
On Friday, President Bush signed into law the American Service Members Protection Act of 2002, which will supposedly protect U.S. service members from the International Criminal Court. The new law authorizes the use of military force to liberate any American or citizen of a U.S. allied country being held by the court. This provision, dubbed the Hague Invasion Clause, has caused a strong reaction from U.S. allies around the world, particularly in the Netherlands.
And since the court is going to be based in The Hague in the Netherlands, a close NATO ally, this in essence allows the United States to engage in an act of war, to declare war against a fellow NATO ally. It's an amazing act.
And one of the amendments that was accepted into the law was to restrict US support for the UN unless it specifically exempts US troops from prosecution. They were once again pushing for immunity for just themselves. And this act passed with a lot of support from characters that are still around today, like Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton, and current presidential nominee Joe Biden. And since the US still didn't have permanent immunity, President Bush sent infamous war criminal John Bolton on a trip to 100 countries in an attempt to force them to sign bilateral immunity agreements, also known as a BIA. If a country signed and ratified their BIA, they would have to shield the US from prosecution from the ICC. So that meant if the US committed a war crime in that country's territory, the ICC wouldn't be able to prosecute them, meaning the US would now have immunity in just that one country. And to achieve this, Bush threatened to cut aid to any country that didn't ratify their agreement, and most of them didn't. So what did Bush do? He actually cut aid to those countries because they wouldn't exempt the US from prosecution. This all comes back to the fact that the US only cares about their own immunity and protecting themselves from war crimes prosecution. If they weren't concerned about this, they wouldn't have threatened to invade the Netherlands and then force countries to sign agreements that exempted just them from prosecution. And let me remind you, the ICC was only created to prosecute war crimes, so if the US just stopped committing them, they would have nothing to worry about. The Senate Committee on Foreign Relations back in 1998 actually feared that the US would have to stop committing war crimes, which obviously they haven't done. And only now, 22 years later, the US is finally being investigated for the first time. And once again, the US is doing almost everything in its power to stop the ICC. They weren't able to veto the investigation, so President Trump is trying other means, like attacking the staff of the ICC and their family members as well. It's crazy to think in over 20 years, and despite the changing of presidents, the US reaction to the court hasn't changed in the slightest. Well, anyway, that's enough from me. I know it's probably a lot to take in, so thank you very much for watching. And if you liked the video and want to support my work, you can make a donation to my PayPal account. The link will be down below. You can also support me in other ways by sharing this video and subscribing. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter. The links will be down below as well. Cheers and thanks for watching.